Ethan stepped out of the taxi and took a deep breath, the familiar scent of pine trees and fresh air filling his lungs. The 2-week business trip had been grueling, and all he could think about was getting home to his wife, Linda, and his mother, Margaret. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder and walked up the path to the front door, noticing how the golden light of the late afternoon sun bathed the house in a warm, welcoming glow. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, a wave of comfort washed over him. The house was quiet, the faint scent of vanilla candles lingering in the air. Ethan smiled to himself, appreciating the little touches that Linda always added to make their home feel cozy. He set his bag down by the door and glanced around, expecting to hear the sound of Linda's voice or his mother's soft footsteps. But the house remained silent. Ethan walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing lightly on the polished hardwood floors. The living room was immaculate, the cushions on the couch perfectly arranged, and not a speck of dust in sight. Everything was as it should be, but something felt off. The house was too quiet. He moved further into the house, and as he approached the kitchen, he noticed a figure crouched on the floor. His heart skipped a beat when he realized it was his mother. Margaret, a woman who had always been strong and independent, was on her knees, scrubbing the floor with a small brush. Her back was hunched, and her hands were red and trembling from the effort. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was filled with shock and concern. Margaret looked up, startled, her face pale and drawn. She tried to smile, but it was a weak attempt, the strain in her expression impossible to hide. "Oh, Ethan. You're home early," she said, quickly averting her eyes as if ashamed to be caught in such a state. Ethan rushed over, dropping to his knees beside her. "What are you doing? Why are you cleaning the floor?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Margaret's hands shook as she placed the brush down. I just wanted to help out around the house," she mumbled, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged as if carrying an unbearable weight. Before Margaret could say more, Linda entered the kitchen, holding a tray with a cup of tea. She seemed surprised to see Ethan, but she quickly masked it with a bright smile. "Ethan, you're back. I didn't expect you so soon," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. Ethan stood up, helping his mother to her feet. "Linda, why is Mom cleaning the floor?" "She shouldn't be doing this," he said, his tone sharp with concern. Linda's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh," Margaret insisted on helping out. "She likes to stay busy, you know that," she said, setting the tray down on the counter. "I was just about to bring her some tea." Margaret nodded quickly, as if eager to back up Linda's story. "It's true, Ethan. I don't want to be a burden. I just want to do my part," she said, though her voice was laced with exhaustion. Ethan frowned, not entirely convinced. He could see the weariness in his mother's eyes, the way she winced slightly as she straightened up. He knew his mother well enough to sense that something wasn't right, but he didn't want to cause a scene right after returning home. "Mom, you don't have to clean. You're here to relax, remember? To take it easy," Ethan said gently, guiding her to sit down at the kitchen table. Margaret hesitated, glancing at Linda, who stood by, her expression unreadable. "I know, dear. I don't want to feel useless," she said softly, looking down at her hands. Ethan sighed, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. "You're not useless, Mom. You've done more than enough for all of us. Now it's our turn to take care of you," he said, trying to reassure her. Linda stepped forward, her smile returning. "Why don't you rest for a bit, Margaret?" "I'll finish up here," she said, her tone sweet and soothing. Margaret nodded, clearly grateful for the reprieve. She patted Ethan's hand gently before getting up and slowly making her way out of the kitchen. Ethan watched her go, a sense of unease lingering in the back of his mind. He turned to Linda, his brow furrowed. "Linda, are you sure she's okay? She looks really tired." Linda waved off his concern with a dismissive gesture. "She's fine, Ethan. She just needs to keep busy. It helps her feel useful," she said, her tone light and reassuring. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He watched Linda carefully, noting the way she quickly busied herself with the tea, avoiding his gaze. There was something in her demeanor that didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. For now, he decided to let it go. But the image of his mother, on her knees scrubbing the floor, stayed with him, a nagging feeling of doubt creeping into his mind. Ethan couldn't shake the image of his mother scrubbing the floor from his mind. That night, as he lay in bed next to Linda, the unease gnawed at him. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. He glanced over at Linda, who was already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. He envied her ability to drift off so easily while his thoughts raced. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, slipping out of bed without disturbing Linda. He found his mother in the kitchen, already awake and dressed, preparing breakfast as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. "Good morning, Mom," Ethan greeted her, trying to keep his tone light, though the concern from the previous day still lingered in his voice. Margaret turned to him with a warm smile, but there was a tiredness behind her eyes that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" she asked, her hands busy whisking eggs. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, watching her closely. "I did. But Mom, you really shouldn't be up this early, cooking and cleaning. You're supposed to be resting," he said gently. Margaret chuckled softly, though the sound lacked its usual warmth. "I'm not one to sit around and do nothing, Ethan. You know that. Keeping busy helps me, it helps me feel useful," she repeated, echoing what she had said the day before. Ethan frowned, his unease growing. "But Mom, you looked exhausted yesterday. Are you sure you're okay? You can tell me if something's wrong," he pressed, hoping she would open up. Margaret paused for a moment, her hand stilling as she looked down at the eggs. She seemed to be considering his words, but then she shook her head, her smile returning, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Ethan. Really. Don't worry about me," she said, her tone firm, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. Before Ethan could say more, Linda walked into the kitchen, her hair still tousled from sleep. She greeted them both with a smile, her eyes bright and cheerful. "Good morning. What's for breakfast?" she asked, moving to pour herself a cup of coffee. Ethan watched as his mother quickly resumed cooking, her movements more hurried now that Linda was in the room. He couldn't ignore the slight tension in the air, the way his mother's shoulders seemed to hunch just a bit more when Linda was nearby. "Linda, I was just telling Mom she doesn't need to be up this early, doing all this work. We can handle breakfast," Ethan said, trying to gauge his wife's reaction. Linda glanced at Margaret, then back at Ethan, her smile unwavering. "Oh," Margaret insisted, "didn't you?" she said lightly, taking a sip of her coffee. "She's always been an early riser, and she loves taking care of us. It makes her happy." Margaret nodded quickly, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "That's right. I like to keep busy." "It's no trouble at all," she said, her voice slightly strained. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something wasn't adding up. His mother wasn't one to lie, but he could tell she wasn't being entirely truthful either. He wanted to press further, to get to the bottom of what was really going on, but he could see the unease in Margaret's eyes, the way she kept glancing at Linda as if afraid of what she might say. "Okay, but you don't have to do this every day, Mom," Ethan said, finally relenting. "Just take it easy, okay?" Margaret nodded, though Ethan could tell she was just agreeing to put his mind at ease. He forced a smile, but the doubt gnawed at him, a persistent worry that he couldn't shake. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Ethan couldn't help but notice the small things that now seemed out of place. The way his mother quickly moved out of Linda's way when she entered a room, the way she seemed to flinch slightly at loud noises or sudden movements, and the way Linda's tone changed ever so slightly when she spoke to Margaret, adopting a more authoritative, almost dismissive edge. That evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, Ethan finally decided to voice his concerns to Linda. They were sitting in the living room, the TV on in the background, but Ethan wasn't paying attention to it. He turned to Linda, his expression serious. Linda, I need to ask you something, he began, trying to keep his tone calm. Is everything okay with Mom? She seems different. Tired. Almost like she's afraid of something. Linda looked up from the magazine she was flipping through, her expression one of mild surprise. Afraid? Of what, Ethan? She asked, her tone light, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something Ethan couldn't quite place. I don't know, Ethan admitted. But I feel like something's off. Yesterday, when I came home and saw her on the floor like that, it didn't seem right. Linda's smile faded slightly, and she set the magazine down. Ethan, you're worrying too much. Your mother's fine. She just likes to stay busy, like she said. I know it's hard for her to adjust to not having your father around anymore. She's just trying to find her place here. Ethan nodded slowly, but the unease remained. I just don't want her overworking herself or feeling like she has to do everything around the house, he said, his voice filled with concern. Linda reached over and took his hand, her expression softening. I understand, Ethan. I'll make sure she doesn't overdo it. We'll both keep an eye on her, okay? She said reassuringly. Ethan squeezed her hand, forcing a smile. Okay. Thanks, Linda. But as they sat there, the unease in Ethan's chest didn't ease. If anything, it grew stronger, a nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. He resolved to keep a closer watch on his mother and on Linda, determined to figure out what was really going on in his home. Over the next few days, Ethan kept a closer watch on his mother, paying attention to the small details that he might have missed before. He started to notice patterns, subtle but troubling. Margaret seemed to be avoiding Linda whenever possible. She would quickly retreat to her room when Linda entered the room, or if she couldn't avoid her, she'd find an excuse to busy herself with some task that would keep her out of sight. Ethan also noticed that Margaret was eating less and less. He often found her picking at her food, barely touching her meals, and when he asked if something was wrong, she'd just wave him off with a weak smile and say she wasn't very hungry. The more he observed, the more Ethan's concern grew. One afternoon, Ethan decided to take a break from work and head home early, hoping to catch his mother alone and get her to open up. When he arrived, the house was quiet, as usual. He found Margaret sitting in the living room, folding laundry, a task that should have been simple, but she looked so weary and slow, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Mom, let me help you with that, Ethan offered, sitting down beside her. Margaret looked up at him, startled, and then quickly shook her head. No, Ethan. It's fine. I'm almost done, she insisted, but Ethan could see how tired she was. He took the laundry from her hands gently, setting it aside. Mom, please. Just talk to me. You've been so quiet lately, and you're not eating much. I'm worried about you, he said softly, searching her face for any sign that she might open up. Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. I'm fine, Ethan. Really? I guess I'm still adjusting. It's been hard, after losing your father, she said, her voice shaky. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart aching for her. I know it's been hard, Mom. But you don't have to do everything yourself. You should be resting, taking it easy. Let Linda and me take care of things, he urged. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else, fear, perhaps. But before Ethan could say more, the front door opened, and Linda walked in, carrying a few grocery bags. Ethan, you're home early, Linda said with a bright smile, setting the bags down on the kitchen counter. What a nice surprise. Ethan forced a smile, glancing at his mother, who quickly rose from the couch, her movements stiff and anxious. Yeah, I just thought I'd come home and check on things, Ethan replied, watching Margaret as she hurriedly gathered the laundry and made her way to the hallway, her shoulders hunched. Linda's gaze followed Margaret briefly before turning back to Ethan. Well, it's good to have you home, she said, her tone light and cheerful. I just picked up a few things for dinner. Why don't you relax while I start cooking? Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were still on his mother. He decided to let Linda handle dinner and went to find Margaret in her room. He knocked gently on the door before entering, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, folding the same clothes she had been working on earlier. "Mom, you didn't have to rush off like that," Ethan said softly, sitting down beside her. Margaret kept her gaze on the clothes in her lap, her fingers nervously picking at a loose thread. I don't want to be in the way, Ethan. I don't want to cause any trouble," she murmured. Ethan frowned, his concern deepening. "Mom, you're not in the way. This is your home too. Please, if something's bothering you, you can tell me," he urged. Margaret hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. But before she could say anything, there was a knock on the door, and Linda's voice called out, "Dinner's almost ready." Margaret immediately tensed, her gaze flicking towards the door. "I'll be right there," she called back, her voice tight. She turned to Ethan, forcing a smile. "You should go. Linda's made dinner. I'll be fine." Ethan could see the anxiety in his mother's eyes, and it only made his resolve stronger. "Okay, Mom. But we'll talk later, all right?" "Just the two of us," he said, his tone firm but gentle. Margaret nodded, but Ethan could tell she was relieved when he left the room. As he made his way to the dining room, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Something was definitely wrong, and his mother's reluctance to speak only confirmed it. During dinner, Ethan tried to engage his mother in conversation, but she was quiet, her responses short and distracted. Linda, on the other hand, was her usual cheerful self, chatting about her day and asking Ethan about his work. But even Linda's bright demeanor couldn't mask the tension in the air, and Ethan noticed how his mother's shoulders would tense whenever Linda addressed her. After dinner, as they were clearing the table, Ethan decided to try again. He waited until Linda was out of earshot, then gently touched his mother's arm. "Mom, are you sure everything's okay? You don't have to keep this to yourself. I'm here for you," he said softly. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to say something, but just as she did, Linda returned to the kitchen, and Margaret quickly shut down, her expression going blank. "Everything all right?" Linda asked, glancing between them. Ethan forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just checking on Mom," he said, though the weight of his concern pressed heavily on him. Linda smiled and turned back to the dishes, humming softly to herself. But Ethan's mind was racing. His mother was clearly afraid to talk in front of Linda, and that only confirmed Ethan's worst fears. That night, as Ethan lay in bed beside Linda, he stared up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the look in his mother's eyes, the fear, the sadness. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this, but he also knew that his mother wouldn't open up easily, especially not with Linda around. Ethan resolved to dig deeper, to find out what was really going on, even if it meant confronting some uncomfortable truths. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan knew that the cracks in the facade of his perfect life were growing wider, and soon, something would have to give. Ethan couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. The more he thought about his mother's behavior, the more convinced he became that there was more to the story than she was letting on. He needed to know the truth, even if it meant digging where he hadn't before. The following day, Ethan decided to take action. Linda had gone out to run errands, leaving him alone in the house with Margaret. It was the perfect opportunity to search for any clues that might explain what was really happening. He felt uneasy about snooping around, but his concern for his mother outweighed any guilt. He started in the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers, looking for anything out of place. But everything seemed normal, too normal, as if everything had been meticulously arranged to hide any evidence of wrongdoing. Frustrated, Ethan moved on to the living room, scanning the room for anything unusual. Again, nothing. Finally, Ethan made his way to the study, where he and Linda kept important documents and the household computer. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the desk and powered on the computer. He knew Linda often handled the household finances and other affairs, so if there was anything suspicious, it might be here. As he navigated through the files, something caught his eye, a folder labeled Security. His heart skipped a beat. He clicked on it, and inside, he found a series of video files dated over the past few weeks. It was footage from the security cameras they had installed around the house, originally meant for safety and peace of mind. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the first video. The footage showed the living room, where Margaret was sitting alone, folding laundry. She looked tired, her movements slow and labored. A few moments later, Linda entered the room. Ethan watched as Linda walked over to Margaret, her expression cold and unkind. "What are you doing sitting around?" "There's still work to be done," Linda's voice came through the speakers, harsh and impatient. Margaret looked up, startled, and quickly set the laundry aside. "I'm sorry, I was just taking a little break," she began, but Linda cut her off. "You don't get breaks. You're here to help out, not to lounge around. Now get up and finish the chores," Linda snapped, her tone commanding. Ethan's blood ran cold as he watched the scene unfold. His mother, looking defeated and frightened, rose from the couch and hurried to comply with Linda's orders. Linda didn't lift a finger to help, she just watched, arms crossed, her expression filled with disdain. Ethan felt a surge of anger and disbelief. How could Linda treat his mother this way? The woman who had welcomed her into their home, who had always been kind and loving. He clicked on the next video, and the next, each one revealing more of the same, Linda berating Margaret, ordering her around, treating her like a servant. His heart pounded in his chest as he opened the final video. This one was from the day he had returned from his business trip. The footage showed Margaret on her knees, scrubbing the floor, just as he had found her. But this time, he saw what had led up to that moment. Linda stood over Margaret, holding a small bucket of soapy water. "This floor better be spotless by the time Ethan gets home," Linda said coldly, handing Margaret the bucket and a brush. Margaret took the items with trembling hands, her expression one of resignation. "Yes, of course," she murmured, kneeling down to begin scrubbing. "Don't think I won't tell Ethan how lazy you've been while he was gone," Linda added, her voice dripping with malice. Ethan couldn't watch anymore. He slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking with rage. The woman he had trusted, the woman he loved, had been abusing his mother right under his nose. He had been blind to it, dismissing his own instincts in favor of maintaining the peace. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and there was no turning back. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. He knew he had to confront Linda about this, but he also needed to protect his mother. He couldn't let this go on for another day. Just as he was about to leave the study, he heard the front door open. Linda was back. Ethan's heart raced as he quickly gathered his thoughts. He couldn't confront her here, not with Margaret in the house. He needed a plan, a way to ensure his mother's safety while he dealt with Linda. He walked out to the hallway, where Linda was putting away the groceries she had bought. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Hey, you. What have you been up to?" she asked, her tone cheerful and casual, as if nothing was wrong. Ethan forced a smile, hiding the turmoil within. "Just catching up on some work," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. He couldn't let her see that he knew, not yet. "Great. I was thinking we could have a nice dinner tonight, just the three of us," Linda suggested, still smiling as she put the last of the groceries away. Ethan nodded, but his mind was racing. He needed to get his mother out of the house, somewhere safe, before he confronted Linda. "That sounds good. Actually, I was thinking Mom and I could go out for a bit this afternoon, maybe get some fresh air," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Linda looked at him curiously. "Oh? Where are you planning to go?" "Just a walk around the park, maybe grab some coffee." "I think it'll do her some good," Ethan said, carefully watching Linda's reaction. Linda hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Sure, that sounds nice." She could use the fresh air, she agreed, though there was a hint of something in her eyes, suspicion, perhaps. Ethan felt a flicker of relief. He would take his mother out, far away from the house, and once she was safe, he would confront Linda about everything he had seen. It was the only way to protect Margaret and put an end to the abuse she had been enduring. As Linda busied herself with preparing lunch, Ethan went to find his mother. She was in her room, sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden. She looked so small and frail, and Ethan's heart ached at the thought of what she had been going through. "Mom, would you like to go out for a bit? Maybe take a walk and get some coffee," he asked gently, hoping to ease her mind. Margaret looked at him, surprised. "A walk? Oh, I don't know, Ethan. I'm not really up for it," she said, her voice weary. "Please, Mom. It'll be good for you." "Just a short walk," Ethan urged, his voice soft but insistent. Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, if you think it's a good idea." Ethan smiled, helping her to her feet. "I do, Mom. Let's go." As they left the house, Ethan felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew that what he was about to do would change everything, but he also knew it was necessary. He couldn't allow his mother to suffer any longer. They walked in silence for a while, the fresh air doing little to calm the storm in Ethan's mind. He led his mother to a small cafe near the park, where they could sit and talk. Once they were settled with their drinks, Ethan took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he had to say. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," he began, his voice steady but filled with concern. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "What is it, Ethan?" Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "Is Linda treating you badly? Please, don't hide anything from me. I need to know the truth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Ethan, I didn't want to cause any trouble. I didn't want to make things difficult for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan's heart shattered at her words. "Mom, you're not causing any trouble. You're my mother, and I love you. I need to protect you. Please, tell me everything," he urged, his voice trembling with emotion. Margaret finally looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "Linda, she's been so cruel, Ethan. She makes me do all the housework, and if I don't do it perfectly, she yells at me. She's threatened to tell you lies about me, to make you send me away," she confessed, her voice shaking. Ethan felt a wave of rage and sorrow crash over him. He had suspected it, but hearing it from his mother was a different kind of pain. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Margaret squeezed his hand, her tears still falling. "I didn't want to burden you, Ethan. I thought I could handle it, but I can't anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. Ethan's resolve hardened. "You don't have to handle it alone anymore. I'm going to take care of this, Mom. I promise you, it ends today," he said, his voice filled with determination. Margaret nodded, her grip on his hand tightening as she drew strength from his words. Ethan knew what he had to do. He would confront Linda, and he would make sure his mother was safe, no matter the cost. As they finished their coffee, Ethan's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He knew that the confrontation ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had to be, for his mother's sake. Ethan drove home in silence, his mother seated beside him, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery but her thoughts clearly elsewhere. The weight of the truth she had just shared with him hung heavily in the air between them, thick with unspoken fears and unresolved pain. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they neared the house. He knew that what he was about to do could change everything, but he also knew it was necessary. His mother's well-being depended on it. When they arrived home, Ethan helped Margaret out of the car and led her inside. Linda was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The familiar scent of roasting chicken filled the air, but to Ethan, it was suffocating, a stark contrast to the tension boiling inside him. "Linda," Ethan called out, his voice strained. Linda turned, her face lighting up when she saw them. "You're back." Just in time for dinner, she said cheerfully, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Linda's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. "Sure. What's on your mind?" she asked, though there was a hint of suspicion in her voice. Ethan glanced at his mother, who stood quietly by his side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mom, why don't you go rest in your room for a bit?" "I'll take care of this," he said gently. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with worry, but she nodded and turned to leave the room. Ethan watched her go, his heart heavy with the burden of what he was about to do. Once she was out of sight, Ethan turned back to Linda, his expression hardening. "I know what you've been doing," he said bluntly. Linda blinked, her confusion quickly replaced by a defensive edge. "What are you talking about?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I'm talking about how you've been treating my mother," Ethan said, his voice low and filled with barely restrained anger. "I found the security footage, Linda. I saw everything." For a moment, Linda said nothing, her face blank as if she was processing his words. Then, slowly, a cold smile spread across her lips. "So, you finally figured it out," she said, her tone laced with mockery. Ethan's blood boiled at her reaction. "How could you do this? How could you treat her like that? She's done nothing but try to help, and you've been abusing her," he shouted, his anger finally breaking through. Linda's expression remained calm, almost eerily so. "I did what I had to do, Ethan. Your mother is a burden. She's old, weak, and she's holding us back. I'm the one who keeps this house running, and I needed her to pull her weight," she said, her voice cold and calculated. Ethan stared at her in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. "A burden? She's my mother, Linda. She's not a servant. How could you say something like that?" Linda's eyes narrowed, her patience wearing thin. "You're being naive, Ethan. Your mother has overstayed her welcome. She's old, she's in the way, and she's draining us both, emotionally and financially. I've just been doing what needed to be done to keep things in order," she said, her voice hardening with every word. Ethan felt a surge of anger so intense that it nearly overwhelmed him. He had never seen this side of Linda before, this cold, heartless person who stood before him. "You've crossed the line, Linda. You've been cruel and abusive, and I won't stand for it. I'm taking my mother out of this house tonight," he said, his voice trembling with fury. Linda's cold smile returned, her eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. "And where will you go, Ethan? This is our house. Your mother has no place here anymore, and if you take her with you, you'll be throwing away everything we've built together," she said, her tone dripping with malice. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes blazing with determination. "I don't care. I'll find somewhere else. But I will not let you continue to hurt her. She's done nothing to deserve this, and I won't let you destroy her," he said, his voice firm. Linda laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "You're so noble, aren't you? Always trying to do the right thing. But let me tell you something, Ethan, you'll regret this. If you walk out that door with her, you're throwing away your marriage, your life, everything we've built," she said, her voice filled with venom. Ethan's heart ached at her words, but he knew what he had to do. "If this is the kind of person you've become, then I don't want to be a part of this marriage anymore," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "My mother comes first, and if that means losing you, then so be it." Linda's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold fury. "You'll regret this, Ethan. Mark my words," she spat, her eyes flashing with anger. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. He went to his mother's room, finding her sitting on the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mom, we're leaving," Ethan said gently, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, what happened? What did she say?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "It doesn't matter, Mom. We're leaving. We're going to find somewhere safe, where she can't hurt you anymore," he said, his voice filled with determination. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, trusting him completely. "All right, Ethan. Let's go," she whispered. Ethan helped her pack a small bag with her essentials, then led her out of the room. As they walked through the house, he could feel Linda's eyes on them, cold and unforgiving. But he didn't look back. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. When they reached the door, Ethan paused, taking one last look around the home he had once cherished. He had built a life here with Linda, but now it was all shattered. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he had made the right choice. With a deep breath, Ethan opened the door and stepped outside, his mother by his side. As they walked to the car, he felt a sense of relief washing over him, mingled with the sorrow of what he was leaving behind. But above all, he felt a fierce determination to protect his mother, no matter what it took. As they drove away from the house, Ethan glanced over at Margaret. She was quiet, her eyes filled with sadness, but there was also a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that hope too. The drive to the small, family-owned motel on the outskirts of town was filled with a heavy silence. Margaret sat quietly beside Ethan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes staring out the window as the familiar streets of their neighborhood gave way to the unfamiliar roads of the rural outskirts. Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on both of them. When they finally arrived, Ethan parked the car and turned to his mother. "Mom, I know this isn't ideal, but it's just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent," he said gently, his voice filled with reassurance. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes still clouded with sadness. "I understand, Ethan. Thank you for getting me out of there," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. I should have done this sooner," he said, his voice filled with regret. They checked into the motel, a modest place with faded wallpaper and creaky floors, but it was clean and quiet. Ethan led Margaret to their room, helping her settle in before sitting down beside her on the edge of the bed. Margaret sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping as she looked around the room. "I never thought it would come to this," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Ethan looked at her, his heart aching. "Neither did I, Mom. But we'll get through this. I'll find us a better place tomorrow, somewhere safe where we can start over," he promised, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him. Margaret nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "I just don't understand, Ethan. What did I do wrong? Why did she hate me so much?" she asked, her voice breaking. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. "You didn't do anything wrong, Mom. This wasn't your fault. Linda, she's changed. She became someone I didn't recognize, someone who thought it was okay to treat you that way. But it's over now. You don't have to worry about her anymore," he said, trying to offer some comfort. Margaret nodded, but the sadness in her eyes remained. "I just wanted to help, to be useful," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his work, on his life with Linda, that he hadn't noticed what was happening right under his nose. "You've always been more than useful, Mom. You've done so much for me, for all of us. And now it's my turn to take care of you," he said, his voice filled with determination. Margaret smiled weakly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close as she finally let the tears fall. He could feel her body shaking with quiet sobs, and it broke his heart to see her like this, so vulnerable, so hurt. But he also knew that this was the first step toward healing, the first step toward rebuilding their lives. They stayed like that for a long time, the room silent except for the sound of Margaret's quiet weeping. Ethan held her, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears, as he silently vowed to do whatever it took to make things right. Eventually, Margaret pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't mean to break down like that," she said, her voice shaky. Ethan shook his head, his expression soft. "Don't apologize, Mom. You've been through so much. It's okay to let it out," he said gently. Margaret nodded, though she still looked fragile, as if she might break at any moment. "I'm just so tired, Ethan. Tired of feeling like a burden, tired of being afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart ached at her words. "You're not a burden, Mom. You never were, and you never will be. I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, hoping to instill some sense of security in her. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you are, Ethan. And I'm so grateful for that," she said softly. Ethan helped her get ready for bed, making sure she was comfortable before turning off the lights. As he settled into the chair by the window, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decisions he had made. He had left behind the life he had built with Linda, the life he had once thought was perfect. But now he realized that perfection had been an illusion, one that had shattered the moment he discovered the truth. As the night wore on, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the future. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were so many uncertainties: finding a new place to live, dealing with the fallout of his separation from Linda, and most importantly, helping his mother heal from the trauma she had endured. But despite the challenges, Ethan felt a sense of resolve. He had made the right choice, and now it was up to him to see it through. The next morning, Ethan was up early, his mind already racing with plans. He knew they couldn't stay at the motel for long; it was a temporary solution at best. He needed to find a more permanent place where they could feel safe and start rebuilding their lives. After breakfast, Ethan began making phone calls, reaching out to real estate agents and searching online for rental properties. He wanted something small and manageable, a place where they could feel at home without the weight of bad memories. He knew it might take some time, but he was determined to find the right place. As he worked, Margaret sat quietly in the corner, flipping through an old magazine. She seemed calmer today, though the sadness still lingered in her eyes. Ethan made a mental note to talk to her later, to reassure her that things would get better. After a few hours of searching, Ethan finally found a promising lead: a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was clean and safe, and it had everything they needed. He arranged to visit the apartment later that afternoon, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in days. When the time came, Ethan and Margaret drove to the apartment, both of them feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The building was older but well-maintained, with a friendly manager who welcomed them warmly. As they toured the apartment, Ethan could see the tension in Margaret's shoulders begin to ease. The apartment was simple but comfortable, with a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a bedroom with a large window that let in plenty of natural light. "This is nice, Ethan," Margaret said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. "It feels peaceful." Ethan smiled, relieved to see her relaxing. "I think it could be a good place for us, Mom. Somewhere we can start fresh," he said, his voice filled with hope. Margaret nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, I think so too," she agreed, her voice soft. By the time they left the apartment, Ethan had already made up his mind. He filled out the necessary paperwork, determined to secure the place as soon as possible. As they drove back to the motel, he felt a sense of relief, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. Later that evening, as they sat together in their motel room, Ethan took his mother's hand. "I know this isn't going to be easy, but we're going to get through it, Mom. We're going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Margaret smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "I believe you, Ethan. And I'm so grateful to have you by my side," she whispered. Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with love and resolve. He knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but he also knew that they would face it together, one step at a time. As the night wore on, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a better future. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting a soft glow over the small space. Ethan had slept fitfully, his mind racing with the weight of the decisions he had made and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But as he looked over at his mother, still peacefully asleep in the bed, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had taken the first step toward a new life, and now it was time to move forward. After a quick breakfast, Ethan made a few phone calls to finalize the details of their new apartment. The manager had been understanding of their situation and expedited the process, allowing them to move in immediately. By mid-morning, Ethan and Margaret were packing their belongings, which amounted to little more than the few essentials they had brought with them from the house. As they loaded the car, Margaret paused, looking back at the motel room with a mix of emotions. "I know it's not much, but this place has been a refuge for us," she said quietly, her voice tinged with gratitude and sadness. Ethan nodded, understanding her feelings. "It was a safe place when we needed it. But now, it's time to find a place we can truly call home," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Margaret smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Yes, I think you're right," she agreed, though her voice still held a trace of uncertainty. The drive to the new apartment was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. Ethan's mind kept drifting back to Linda, to the life they had built together and how quickly it had all unraveled. He wondered what she was doing now, how she was coping with his absence, but he quickly pushed those thoughts aside. There was no point dwelling on the past. His focus needed to be on the future, on helping his mother heal and rebuilding their lives. When they arrived at the apartment, the manager greeted them warmly and handed over the keys. Ethan and Margaret stepped inside, taking in the space that would now be their home. The apartment was small but cozy, with a welcoming warmth that immediately put them at ease. The walls were a soft cream color, and the sunlight streaming through the windows gave the place a cheerful, inviting feel. Margaret wandered through the rooms, her hands gently brushing over the countertops and furniture as if trying to familiarize herself with the new surroundings. "It's lovely, Ethan. I think we'll be happy here," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet determination. Ethan smiled, relieved to see the tension easing from her shoulders. "I think so too, Mom. It's a fresh start for both of us," he said, his voice full of hope. They spent the rest of the day unpacking their belongings and settling into the apartment. Ethan made sure to set up Margaret's room first, arranging her things just the way she liked them. He could see the relief in her eyes as she began to arrange her personal items, her movements more relaxed than they had been in weeks. As the sun began to set, Ethan prepared a simple dinner for the two of them. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the atmosphere much lighter than it had been in the days before. Margaret seemed more at ease, though the shadows of the past still lingered in her eyes. "Thank you, Ethan," Margaret said quietly as they finished their meal. "For everything. I know this hasn't been easy for you." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with love and resolve. "Mom, you don't need to thank me. I'm just glad we're here, together. We'll get through this, one day at a time," he said firmly, hoping to reassure her. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know we will. And I'm so grateful to have you by my side," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. After dinner, they spent the evening unpacking the last of their belongings, each of them trying to find comfort in the familiar items that now filled their new home. As the night wore on, the apartment began to feel more like a place of refuge, a sanctuary where they could begin to heal and rebuild their lives. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed, his thoughts drifted to the future. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. There would be legal battles, emotional struggles, and the ongoing task of helping his mother recover from the trauma she had endured. But despite the uncertainty, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, determined to start putting the pieces of his life back together. The first step was to consult a lawyer about the separation from Linda and the potential legal implications of everything that had happened. He wanted to ensure that his mother was protected and that they could move forward without the shadow of the past hanging over them. As he got dressed, Ethan noticed his mother already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked more rested than she had in days, though there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. "Good morning, Mom," Ethan greeted her, trying to sound upbeat. Margaret smiled, though it was tinged with melancholy. "Good morning, Ethan. You're up early," she observed. "I've got a few things to take care of today, but I'll be back by lunchtime," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from her. Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're going to see a lawyer, aren't you?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I need to make sure everything is in order, for both of us," he said carefully, not wanting to upset her. Margaret looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I understand. Just be careful, Ethan. Linda isn't going to take this lightly," she warned, her voice filled with concern. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "I will, Mom. But I'm not going to let her hurt you, or me, anymore. We're going to be okay," he said, his voice firm with resolve. Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "I know, Ethan. I just don't want you to lose everything because of me," she whispered. Ethan shook his head, his heart aching at her words. "You're not the reason, Mom. This is about doing what's right. And I'll make sure we come out of this stronger," he promised. After breakfast, Ethan left the apartment and headed to the law office he had contacted the day before. The lawyer he met with was a calm, experienced man who listened carefully as Ethan explained the situation. Ethan felt a sense of relief as they discussed the legal options available, including filing for a legal separation and seeking a restraining order if necessary. By the time the meeting was over, Ethan felt more confident about the path ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to fight for what was right, for himself, and most importantly, for his mother. When Ethan returned to the apartment, he found Margaret sitting by the window, gazing out at the world beyond. She turned and smiled when she saw him, though the sadness in her eyes remained. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "It went well. The lawyer thinks we have a good case, and we're going to start the process of filing for separation. We're going to get through this, Mom," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan. I know this isn't easy, but I'm so grateful to have you by my side," she whispered. Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with love and resolve. "We're going to be okay, Mom. I promise," he said softly. As they sat together in the quiet apartment, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a step in the right direction, a step toward healing, toward rebuilding, and toward a future filled with hope. The days following the meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity and emotions. Ethan threw himself into the process of securing their future, determined to protect his mother and ensure they could both move forward without the shadow of the past hanging over them. There were papers to sign, meetings to attend, and difficult conversations to be had, but through it all, Ethan remained steadfast. Margaret, for her part, was slowly beginning to find her footing again. The new apartment, with its soft light and cozy corners, had started to feel like a real home. She spent her days tending to the small indoor plants she had bought, finding solace in the routine of watering and caring for them. Each day brought a little more strength, a little more hope. One afternoon, as they were sitting together in the living room, Margaret looked up from her book and studied Ethan's face. He had been on the phone for most of the morning, dealing with the logistics of the separation, and she could see the toll it was taking on him. "Ethan, you've been working so hard to make sure we're okay," she said softly, her voice filled with concern. "But I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too." Ethan looked up from his notes, surprised by her words. "I'm fine, Mom. I just want to make sure everything is in place so we can move on," he said, though he knew she could see the fatigue in his eyes. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. I appreciate everything you're doing, but I don't want you to burn yourself out. We've both been through so much, and I want to make sure you're taking the time to heal too, she said, her voice filled with love and concern. Ethan sighed, squeezing her hand. I know, Mom. I don't want to leave anything to chance. I need to make sure we're safe, that we're protected, he said, his voice tinged with the weight of responsibility. Margaret nodded, understanding the burden he was carrying. We will be, Ethan. But you don't have to do it all on your own. We can take things one step at a time, together, she said gently. Ethan looked into her eyes, seeing the quiet strength that had always been there, even in the darkest of times. He realized that she was right, they were in this together, and they both needed time to heal and rebuild. You're right, Mom, Ethan said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We'll take it one step at a time. The days passed, and slowly, a new routine began to take shape. Ethan continued to handle the legal matters, but he also made sure to carve out time for himself and his mother. They took walks in the nearby park, spent afternoons reading together, and even started cooking meals together in their small but functional kitchen. Margaret began to regain some of the confidence she had lost. She started reaching out to old friends, reconnecting with people she had lost touch with during the difficult months with Linda. The support she received from them was a balm to her wounded spirit, and she began to see that there was still joy to be found in life. One evening, as they sat together on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, Margaret turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with a gentle warmth. I never thought I'd feel this way again, she said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. Feel what way, Mom? Hopeful, she said simply, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. For a long time, I felt like my life was over, that I was just a burden. But now, I see that there's still so much to look forward to. So much to be grateful for. Ethan smiled, his chest tight with emotion. You were never a burden, Mom. You've always been a blessing in my life, and I'm so grateful that we have this chance to start over, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret reached over and took his hand, her grip strong and steady. We both needed this fresh start, Ethan. And I'm so proud of you for everything you've done, for standing by me, for protecting me. I don't know what I would have done without you, she said, her voice filled with love. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't try to hold them back. I'm just glad we're here, together. I know it hasn't been easy, but I believe that things are going to get better. We're going to be okay, he said, his voice full of quiet determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in twilight, Ethan and Margaret sat in comfortable silence, their hands clasped together as they watched the stars begin to appear. The night was cool, but the warmth of their bond, the strength of their love, wrapped around them like a protective blanket. In the days that followed, Ethan continued to work through the legal process, each step bringing them closer to finalizing the separation from Linda. It was a difficult and often painful process, but with each signature, each document filed, he felt a little more of the weight lifting from his shoulders. Margaret, too, found herself growing stronger with each passing day. She began volunteering at a local community center, where she could use her skills and experience to help others. The sense of purpose it gave her was a lifeline, a reminder that she still had so much to give to the world. The new life they were building wasn't without its challenges, but it was theirs, forged through hardship and sustained by love. And as the weeks turned into months, both Ethan and Margaret found that they were not just surviving, they were thriving. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light over the room, Ethan turned to his mother with a thoughtful expression. Mom, have you ever thought about what you want to do next? I mean, now that we're settled here, do you have any dreams you'd like to pursue? He asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Margaret looked at him, surprised by the question. She had been so focused on healing, on moving forward, that she hadn't given much thought to the future beyond that. But now, as she considered his words, she felt a spark of excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. You know, Ethan, I've always loved working with children. Maybe I could do something with that, volunteer, or even teach part-time. I want to give back, to help others who might be going through difficult times, she said, her eyes lighting up with the possibilities. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That sounds wonderful, Mom. I think you'd be great at it, he said, his voice full of encouragement. Margaret nodded, a sense of purpose filling her heart. Yes, I think I'd like that very much, she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. As they sat together, talking about the future and the dreams they hoped to pursue, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. They had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, closer, and more determined than ever to make the most of the life they had been given. The past would always be a part of them, a chapter in their story that had shaped who they were. But now, they were ready to turn the page, to write a new chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And as they looked toward the future, hand in hand, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before.